Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. A little housekeeping before I bring you today's episode. I recently released Ask Me Anything number 8, which was the first AMA episode I recorded for supporters only, and it did not go without a hitch. Some of you didn't receive the email with the link to the podcast. So here's the simple fix for this and all of the problems going forward. If you're a supporter of the show at any level, whether through my website or one time or monthly or through Patreon, and you didn't receive the AMA email, or you can't log in to the AMA page on my website for some reason, please email info@samharris.org, and we will sort it out for you. Also, as you know, supporters of the show get advance notice when tickets to live events become available. This sort of thing is time sensitive. I don't know when you will be listening to this, but next week on July 19th, 2017 or thereabouts, tickets will go on sale for an event that I'm doing in New York in January with either Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss and Matt Dillahunty. The organizers are still working out people's schedule. In any case, there will be an event, and I'm pretty sure it will sell out. And I'm reasonably sure the good seats will sell out first. So if you are a supporter of the show and you care about getting access to tickets to an event in New York in January, and you didn't get the recent Ask Me Anything podcast email that went out with respect to AMA number 8, so you're worried that you might not be on the supporters email list, and you are hearing my voice now prior to, let's say, July 23rd, again, please send an email to info@samharris.org and put in the subject line New York event, and we will make sure you get a chance to buy advance tickets the moment they come on sale. After that, everyone will see the link to tickets on my social media accounts. And I'm sure there'll still be some seats left. I think they booked a very big theater, but New York events tend to sell out pretty quickly. Also, I have another event to announce that I'm very excited about. It actually could become a series of events. I have an idea for what I'm calling the Waking Up Book Club. And the idea is that when there's an author who's bringing out a book that I really want to get behind, I will help that author launch his or her book by doing a live event and a podcast. And given the nature of publishing, these events are likely really to always happen in New York or Los Angeles. So this really isn't a tour idea, but it could be an ongoing series of events. And as a test case, I'll be doing a major event with my friend Steve Pinker in Los Angeles in March. Steve has a very important book coming out. It will be a full-on defense of the Enlightenment. And as I think all of you know, I've been wanting to get him on the podcast for a long time now. But Steve is the sort of person who just hunkers down and writes his next book, and he doesn't like to talk too much about it while he's working on it. So one has to wait for his wisdom on whatever topic fascinates him. But the book will be out on February 28th, 2018. So after he launches it on the East Coast, we will do a live event together in Los Angeles, and I will find a great theater, probably with 1,500 to 2,000 seats, and I'll probably do a VIP reception for him after the event. This is the kind of thing that I would feel very awkward about doing just for myself. Other people who produce events and have me speak at them do this sort of thing. And it's one of the things that caused me to scrap the idea of doing the podcast tour, because if I'm producing an event just for me, I don't really feel comfortable having a reception or after party where I say, only those of you who bought a very expensive ticket could come. But strangely, I have no problem at all hosting a VIP event for Steve Pinker, or really for any author I want to support. It sounds like a lot of fun, actually. And this is the sort of thing one has to do to make the economics of events like this work out. So by taking the focus off of me, I have managed to hack my own brain somehow and see a way to produce a big event that would make sense financially. And of course, soon thereafter, I will release the audio here on the podcast. Anyway, this is just a proof of concept, but if it works with Steve, perhaps I will make the Waking Up Book Club an ongoing thing. It'll be at least a month or two before I have specifics to share about that event, but if you're a supporter of the podcast, you will hear about it the moment I have some information. And once again, thank you for your support of the show. You are making all of these things possible. Today I am speaking with Geoffrey West. Geoffrey is a theoretical physicist whose primary interests have been in fundamental questions of physics and biology. He's a senior fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory and a distinguished professor at the Santa Fe Institute, where he served as president from 2005 to 2009. He's been named to Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people in the world, and he is the author of the very fine book Scale: The Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. And we talk about his book at length here. As you'll hear, Geoffrey is an extremely interesting guy. We ran into a few audio problems at the end, so apologies for that. All I can say is that our robot overlords don't yet have this internet thing fully worked out. But I should say that this conversation is pretty dense. I didn't really appreciate how dense it was until I re-listened to it. There's a lot of information here. Those of you who are students of physics and mathematics will absolutely love it. But some of you will find that you really need to concentrate to follow Geoffrey where he goes, and you might need to rewind from time to time or just listen to the whole thing twice. But this will repay your attention because Geoffrey is doing some very deep and interesting work, and his book is really wonderful. And now, without any further delay, I bring you Geoffrey West. I am here with Geoffrey West. Geoffrey, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, Sam. Thank you for inviting me.
You have written this fascinating book called Scale, which links the underlying properties of complex systems to both biological and cultural phenomenon, for really everything from cells to cities.
Yes.
And it's a fascinating route into basically everything we care about. And the book is filled with disarmingly simple-sounding questions, which turn out not to be simple at all. But they're questions like, why do we live 100 years rather than 1,000? Why do we stop growing? We keep eating all the time, but at some point we stop growing. It's not obvious why that should be the case.
Yeah.
Why do people die and companies die, but cities don't seem to die? And before we get into answering these questions, first tell our listeners how you got into this, because you're a theoretical physicist by training, and now you're focusing on biological and even socioeconomic questions. And it seems to have been inspired both by the death of the Super Collider project in the U.S. and your growing sense of your own mortality. So give us the context of your investigations.
Yes, no, thank you. Yes, indeed. You have pinpointed, so to speak, the genesis of this in that, I was at some stage happily doing research into quarks and gluons and string theory and fundamental questions of physics, dark matter and so forth. And associated with that, of course, was this marvelous project of the superconductive super collider to be built in Texas. And of course, the vision was to open up new vistas at extremely high energies and therefore at very short distances and confirm some of our ideas about fundamental forces and the fundamental constituents of nature, but also, just the usual search for, new science, new physics. And sadly, that was canned in the early 90s, and I had been somewhat involved in it. At the same time, I was into my 50s, and it so happens that I come from a line of short-lived males. Very few live beyond about 60, and many have died in their 50s.
I've got a similar problem. I'm just edging into my 50s, and I'm a year shy of the age my father made it to. So yeah, I follow your line of thinking
very
there.
similar. Well, my father did make it to almost 61, but his father, died at 57, and my father's brother died at 54, and so forth. It was that. So it's a similar kind of thing. And so I'd grown up with this idea that, I'd probably die somewhere in my early 60s. That was sort of the lifespan of what was to be expected. And in my 50s, began to realize that, my gosh, I may only have 5 to 10 years at most to live. And it was the confluence of that and the death of the super collider, and some of the things that were being said in terms of, so to speak, justifying why we shouldn't continue with this huge project, that got me to start thinking about some of these big questions in biology originally. And the one thing that really stimulated me and sort of got me emotionally was a statement that many people are familiar with, that was being bandied around, especially in the early 90s, was, physics was the science of the 19th and 20th centuries, whereas biology is clearly going to be the science of the 21st century. And I must say it's sort of hard to argue with that, but there was a corollary to it that was sometimes actually made explicit, oftentimes just implicit. And that was that, we know all the physics we need to know, and, there's no point in, going any further, kind of Philistine view of the intellectual enterprise. And that really got me, because even though, as I said, I agreed with the first part that no doubt biology was going to be significantly important during this century, nevertheless, I arrogantly and out of ignorance, frankly, sort of came back with a statement that, well, yes, that may be the case, but it won't be a real science unless it starts to...
Until it gets a proper case of physics envy.
Exactly, yes, something like that. Yes, to put it, I was hesitating, but to really, start to incorporate the paradigm of physics in terms of it being quantitative, more analytic, based on principles, and therefore more predictive, that kind of paradigm, and also some of the techniques of physics. And so the big question is, to what extent can biology be mathematized and put on a kind of principled basis beyond just, in quotes, the principle of natural selection, but to put that into a more solid foundation. That was where I was coming from before and I must say, I knew almost no biology at the time, but it was that sort of emotional reaction that got me to start thinking at some stage, well, maybe I should think about that seriously. Maybe I should actually start thinking about how you would, in fact, take this fantastic set of ways of thinking and tools that we've developed in physics. How could you take that to biology? And that's where it coupled up with the question of aging and mortality, that I started thinking a little bit about that. And the way I framed it in my head was not just what is the mechanism of aging and why do we die, but to make it slightly more quantitative and say, where in the hell does 100 years come from for the lifespan of a human being? What is that related to? We ought to have a theory, so to begin, put it in this kind of arrogant physics way, if biology were a serious science, then, you should be able to pick up a biology textbook and there would be a chapter about aging and mortality in which there'd be a little calculation that ends up with saying lifespan of a human being should be approximately 100 years. And by the way, the lifespan of a mouse should be of the order of 2 or 3 years, etc. And what I discovered as I started to take this more seriously and read not just biology textbooks, but read the literature on aging and mortality, gerontology in general, was that this was not a very well-developed area at that time. And in particular, as far as I could tell, no one seems to have asked the question in that form. And so I kind of, as a little exercise, so to speak, to spend my spare time in the evenings or on the weekends, I thought, well, maybe I should start thinking about that. How would you go about trying to show that 100 years is the expected lifespan of an animal our size? And what that led me to, first of all, was, if you're going to start thinking about aging mortality, you have to start thinking about what is it that's going wrong in terms of what's keeping you alive. I mean, apply that to any machine, for example. What is it that, so to speak, wears out or starts to become dysfunctional in terms of during its lifespan? And of course, what's keeping you alive is metabolism. That is, you eat and metabolize food to form energy, ATP molecules, the currency of energy. And so then I started reading about metabolism, and in so doing, discovered, I didn't discover, but I learned about these amazing scaling laws, and in particular, this remarkable scaling law for how metabolic rate, that is the amount of energy any organism needs, per second or per hour to stay alive, how that scales with the size of an animal. And to my amazement, I learned that it was extremely simple and regular.
Geoffrey, before we jump into biological scaling, let's just answer a couple of higher level questions here, because
Yeah, sure.
I don't even think people understand what is implied by the word scaling.
Yes, I was going to come to yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's the big picture here is that you point out that the phenomenon that really concern us, that form the space in which we live, span a range of more than 30 orders of magnitude, from molecules to cities. So can you put that in context first?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just take organisms. We go from the smallest organism, which is mycoplasma. It's a tiny subbacterial kind of organism, all the way up to the blue whale. That's about 20 orders of magnitude, 20 powers of 10. So it's enormous. If you go down to molecules, you add several more orders of magnitude. And of course, if you go up to ecosystems and cities, many more. So, you could even stretch this to 40 orders of magnitude in terms of the structure of life. All of these things are to some extent living. I mean, even at the molecular level, you could talk about living things that are doing things that we would call life, sort of primitive viruses, but all the way up to, as I say, a large ecosystem, and in particular, a city, which you can sort of think of for these purposes as a kind of pseudo-organism. So that's kind of amazing because, as I think I point out in the book, this is much greater scale than the relationship of us to the entire Milky Way, for example. Or an electron to a cat. These are we as life span much more than that, and it's kind of amazing. And so that's the range over which the phenomena I discuss in the book are discussed. But the phenomenon of scaling, that is usually called scaling, is how do the characteristics of let's just be a little more modest and stick to, say, just all mammals, for example. How do their characteristics scale as you change the size of a mammal? So mammals go from the smallest, which is a shrew, which sits easily on the palm of the hand, all the way up to the blue whale, which is as big as the building I'm sitting in. And that covers approximately 8 orders of magnitude in its mass. And scaling asks the question, well, let's look at characteristics of these mammals, everything from the one I mentioned earlier, metabolic rate, to something a little more mundane like the length of their aortas. The aorta is the first tube that comes out of the heart, or even, the size of their hearts, or the length of a limb. But all these various things that you could measure, the how long they live, how many offspring they have, and so on. So that's just the concept of scaling. And the remarkable thing is that when you look at any of these quantities, and one can list maybe 50 to 75 of such characteristics and ask how do they change with the size of the mammal, they all scale in that sense in a very regular fashion. And not only in a very regular fashion, but all in a similar way mathematically. And that's extremely surprising naively at a naive level because we believe in natural selection. We believe that all of these organisms have evolved by natural selection with highly contingent histories. Each subsystem of them, each organ, each cell type, each genome has its own unique history. So you might have expected that if you plotted any characteristic such as its metabolic rate versus size, you would get points scattered all over the graph. And quite the contrary, you find that there's a tremendous regularity that gets revealed, suggesting that underlying this extraordinary complexity, because after all, something like metabolism is maybe the most complex process in the universe, for all we know, because it's sort of, at its most primitive level, it takes, matter, stuff, and creates life. That's what we're doing, as we eat and so on. Here's this unbelievably complex process, and yet if you ask how it scales across this huge range of organisms, it scales in this very simple way.
And the amazing thing is this even extends to cities that have different cultural histories and different geographies.
Absolutely. So the same thing, after we did this work and explained where these scaling laws come from, it was very natural to ask the question, are there other forms of life, such as, more synthetic ones, so to speak, like cities or even companies, that express similar kinds of regular systematic scaling. And as I say, later, following understanding the biological scaling, when we looked at the data on the scaling of cities, we found a similar kind of scaling, similar in the sense that there was a regular systematic behavior and the mathematics was the same. The details of it are different, and the details are different in a very important and powerful way. But it was quite similar, and similarly with even with companies, going from a small company of a couple of hundred employees to Walmart or General Motors, there were similar kinds of scaling. So, there's this ubiquitous behavior that is quite surprising when you first meet it, that says that despite, the daunting complexity and diversity that we see out there, underlying it seems to be a kind of simplicity which can be expressed both graphically and mathematically in very powerful and simple terms. So maybe I should say a little bit about what the nature of that scaling
Yeah,
is.
So
Would that be helpful?
yeah, that'd be great. So let's start with the case of biological scaling, and I
Yeah.
just want you to go through the significance of the fact that this scaling tends to be nonlinear. It's either sublinear or
Yes.
superlinear on your account. So what's the significance of that?
Yeah, that's very important because, if you ask yourself, well, look, if I double the size of an organism, or if I look at an organism that's twice the size of another one, or in particular, let's take mammals, as I said, a mammal that's twice the size of another, then it contains, roughly speaking, twice as many cells. And that's linear scaling, and if it's 3 times as big, it contains 3 times as many cells, and that's roughly speaking correct. It's a simple linear relationship. However, the scaling of all other characteristics of an organism are nonlinear in the following sense. Take metabolic rate. If you double the size of an organism, instead of needing twice as much energy, twice as much food, if you like, to stay alive, what you discover is you don't need twice as much. You only need 75% as much, even though there are twice as many cells. And this happens systematically. So if you double the size from 4 grams to 8 grams, or 4 kilograms to 8 kilograms, it doesn't matter where you start. As long as if you double, you only need, roughly speaking, 75%, 3/4 roughly, the amount of energy. There's a 25% savings on the average every time you double. And that's called an economy of scale. That's a classic economy of scale, and means, of course, that the individual cells, since they do scale linearly, it means that the energy needed to support an individual cell is systematically smaller by this 25% rule, the bigger you are every time you double. And so, your cells work less hard in a predictable way than your dogs or cats, but, your horse or your elephant are working even less hard. So this is a pervasive phenomenon throughout biology, this economy of scale, and has far-reaching consequences. So, and that similar kind of scaling gets repeated across any measurable quantity, whether it's physiological, like the one I mentioned, just something sort of mundane like the length of an aorta, or something quite sophisticated like the rates at which oxygen diffuses across membranes, or how long an organism lives, and so on. And these also are governed by an analog to this 25% rule. So timescales increase according to this 25% rule, the bigger you are. And generically, the pace of life slows down. So that, in fact, if you took an elephant and you followed these scaling laws for all its physiology and all its rates of life history, and scaled it according to that, and just kept scaling down, you would end up with a mouse. A mouse is a scaled, at this
tiny elephant,
80-90% level, is a scaled down elephant. And by the way, that brings up something that's very important about the nature of these rules, these laws, and that is that they're not like the laws of physics, which we think of as being precise, like Newton's laws or Maxwell's equations for electricity and magnetism, or quantum mechanics, where we have this, roughly speaking, this paradigm that you can with these principles and laws of physics, you can calculate any physical phenomenon in principle to any degree of accuracy. So that, we know the positions of all the planets at any time. We know the positions of satellites at any time. That's why we can, get our exchange messages on cell phones and so on. Our cell phones work precisely and so forth. So all this works because the laws of physics are extremely precise, and we can calculate things and predict things in a highly precise fashion. That is not true of the kinds of laws that I'm been talking about, this kind of scaling laws I'm talking about in biology. These are laws that we technically call coarse-grained, meaning that they're only true to, say, 80-90% accuracy. So that we can predict, or you can predict from these laws, the following. So just to give you another example, if you give me the size of a mammal, I can tell you pretty much anything about it. Everything from, as I said, its metabolic rate, the complete structure of its circulatory system or its respiratory system. I can tell you about how long it will live, how many offspring it will have, and so on and so forth. All these various measurable characteristics. But I can only do it to 80-90% accuracy. And if I asked to make a prediction about a very specific elephant or a very specific mouse, I couldn't do it with anything more than that accuracy. So it's, so to speak, it's for the average animal of that size.
Right.
But of course, that's extremely powerful, not only because it connects, all these different organisms that seemingly look alike and live in very different environments. It connects them all under sort of one umbrella and shows the kind of unity of life. But also it provides a baseline for asking about specific cases. You can then look at specific animals or specific individuals of that species and start asking questions using the scaling laws as a baseline.
Well, so to talk about one variable here, lifespan. As you
Yes,
get bigger as an animal, perhaps we should confine this to mammals. As you get bigger, you
yes,
tend to live longer, and this
yes,
follows the scaling law that you.
yes.
This is a consequence of metabolism slowing down and economies of scale.
Yeah, so let me back off now and talk more generally about the origin of these scaling laws. Where in the hell do they come from? For example, we just talked mostly here about mammals, but the same scaling laws apply to trees and plants in the following sense. Their metabolic rate scales in the same way as ours does. That is, every time you double the size of a tree in terms of its weight, it uses only 75% more energy, just like we do. But for example, the way its trunk scales, the trunk of a tree scales, is essentially identical to the way our aorta scales.
The tree is its own aorta. It's all aorta. It's all
Well,
circulatory
the
system.
trunk is the aorta.
Yeah, exactly.
No, so let me take that. Let me go from there. The analog to the tree inside us is our circulatory
Right.
system. The aorta, the analog to the aorta, which is that first tube, as I say, coming out of the heart, the analog to that is the trunk of the tree, the part that goes up before it branches into two or three other big branches. And indeed, the origin of these scaling laws, because you ask yourself, what is it? What is it that's common among plants, trees, mammals, birds, fish, etc., that they all seem to obey these same scaling laws, even though their evolved engineered design is quite different. Obviously, we have beating hearts. Trees certainly don't have beating hearts, just to take a dramatic example. So you ask, what is it that's common among all of them? And what you realize is what's common among all of them is that they have all evolved to be hierarchical branching network systems. And you sort of understand that because, just think of yourself, you're made of 10 to the 14th cells, roughly 100 trillion cells. And each one of those has to be serviced in some, roughly speaking, democratic and efficient fashion. And the way that problem has been solved is by evolving these networks that deliver oxygen and nutrients and so on, and information from, if you like, a central reservoir down to the cellular level. And as I say, one we're very familiar with, our circulatory system, our respiratory system, our neural system, our renal system, and so on. And all of these have those characteristics. And the idea is that it is the mathematics and physics, the sort of universal generic mathematics and physics of these network systems at all scales that are being reflected in the scaling laws. And that was the work that I got involved in, and it's quite complicated mathematics to work it all out. But out of that pops these remarkable scaling laws. And I want to say a couple things about the networks, because it's not just the networks, but they have special properties which are, roughly speaking, universal. And one of them is that they are what we technically call space filling. It's a very simple concept. And it's simply that whatever the structure of the network, its terminal units, in our case, for example, the circulatory system, the terminal units are capillaries that feed cells. Those capillaries, so to speak, have to go everywhere because every cell in the body has to be fed by oxygen diffusing from blood, from the capillaries to cells. So the endpoints of the network have to end up close by cells And so the network in that sense has to be space filling and go everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
As, for example, in a city, the road networks essentially have to service all buildings and ultimately all people. So, the street system doesn't leave vast areas of houses without any access to them. So it is with our bodies.
Right.
So that concept is called space filling, and that has to be put into some mathematical terms, and that's one of the inputs or one of the constraints, I should say, on the network.
I think we could introduce a mathematical concept here that will be familiar to people, but it seems relevant. The concept of a fractal, which,
Yes.
I think it seemed like in the 80s, literally everyone knew what fractals were. I mean, like your barber was telling you about the Mandelbrot set.
Exactly.
So we had reached peak fractal back then, but I'm not sure the knowledge has stuck. So perhaps you could remind people about what fractals are and their significance.
Yes. Let me do one last thing before doing that, because it relates directly to it, and that is another constraint on the network, and that is that in some sense the network optimizes the system. I say that loosely, but let me give you an example because it leads to fractals, and that is that the circulatory system that we have, and that has evolved by the process of natural selection. And by we have, I mean the we I'm referring to is all mammals. That is, all mammals that now exist and all mammals that have ever existed. The one that we have minimizes the amount of energy our hearts have to do to pump blood through our circulatory system to feed cells, so that we can maximize the amount of energy we can devote to what is called Darwinian fitness, meaning that we can devote to having sex and rearing children. And that's very important. So that means that whatever the structure of the network is, not only does it have to be space filling, but its structure has to be that if we changed it in any significant way, by just say doubling the length of the third branch of your arterial system, that would increase the amount of energy your heart has to do. And similarly, if you halved the eighth branch of your arterial system, it would increase the energy. So we sit in a kind of basin of optimization, so to speak, of minimizing the energy our hearts have to do.
It seems to me that need not be so in evolutionary terms. I mean, there's a lot, obviously, there's a lot about us that an engineer would not have put in place, and I put the prostate
Yes.
gland high on the list of things you would not have engineered.
Absolutely.
That's just mathematically so. At this point, we can say that it is optimized.
Yeah. So here was the idea. The idea was that, in order to start to take this idea that networks underlie the scaling laws, you have to start putting together the mathematics of the networks. And as in all physics, you need generic principles that transcend, the individual system you're looking at, and you need, certain assumptions. And one of the simplest assumptions was to assume that there was this kind of optimization, that by the continuous feedback process inherent in natural selection, the mammals that have survived, that we are, tend towards minimization of this, the amount of energy that we use to keep ourselves alive. We minimize the amount of energy that is the mundane process of remaining alive, so that we can maximize the amount of energy that we put into our genes going forward. And, that of course need not be. On the other hand, if you believe in Darwinian fitness, and you had long enough time, which we've had, you would expect something like that to happen. But anyway, that was a hypothesis, and it was very natural to hook it up to traditional ideas of Darwinian fitness. But you're absolutely right. There are many aspects of our physiology, especially at my age, that you begin to realize weren't exactly designed in the way that maybe they were optimal. But you have to remember that having said that, that's always the case when you look at one individual component. Like you mentioned, if you look at one specific thing, but you have to remember that that is interconnected with everything else. It's a systemic problem. And the optimization, and that's what part of this idea was, is not so much that it's taken place at the highly local level, and this is extremely important, but it's taken place at the systemic level. I'm talking about the systemic level of each one of these network systems. So it's the entire system going from the heart and the entire structure of the circulatory system from your aorta downwards, feeding through tissue, through capillaries, to cells, and how that diffusion takes place, for example. All of this is one huge system, and it has to be, and the idea is that it is the systemic optimization rather than the local optimization.
Well, I'll take your point, Geoffrey, but if you're going to argue that the prostate gland is a masterpiece of nature and it's God, you're going to have a tough time on this podcast.
And I certainly agree with you with that. Or the way backs are designed, for example, or the way, I still am amazed at the whole process of both reproduction and child and delivery of fetuses into the, into the world.
Why does it have to be a medical emergency every time?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously all of this, but those do not happen. My point is, they do not happen in a vacuum. They're all interconnected, and no doubt something about that birth delivery has all kinds of other implications, not just physiological, but social implications, of course, and so on. So I don't want to argue this. This is not, this is a secondary thing, really, to the main point that, when you look at these networks and you apply these underlying generic systemic principles to them, one of the things that you learn is that the optimal system is fractal-like. I'll use that word. And fractal means, another word for it is self-similar, and we're all very familiar with it. I'm looking out at the moment at a tree, and it has this hierarchical branching network, and the fractality is expressed by the fact that if you cut some branch and remove it, it looks like a little tree.
Right.
And then you can take that little tree and cut a branch of that and take it away, and it looks like an even smaller tree, and so on. And that's the idea, that you have this repetitive self-similarity. And the theory is one of the things that comes out of it is that there is, in fact, that these systems should be fractal in order to optimize in the way I said, and also critical, fill all of space. That is, that it needs to, every part of the system needs to be serviced. By the way, I use the word fractal-like because actually the rules that come out of the theory actually are variants of a fractal. They're, to be a bit more technical about it, it's not a precise self-similar. In other words, and it's in fact true, the data shows this, that if you do take a tree and you cut a piece out of it, it does look like the tree. But if you do measurements, and the theory predicts this, it deviates in a predictable way from the original tree. But it's very close to this idea of repetitive self-similarity. And one of the wonderful things that you discover in all of this, and that is related to the scaling laws, is that all of these systems have somewhere in them some manifestation of this regularity, this fractal regularity that seems to permeate nature. And some of that is no doubt related to, let's put it that way, some of it is related to this idea that something is being optimized.
Yeah, so just to connect the self-similarity and the seemingly endless divisibility of these branching networks to the space filling problem just in a vivid way. This is a fact you describe in the book. So if you ask what the size of our lungs are, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
they are about the size of each about the size of a football, but the surface area of the respiratory membranes in there is about the size of a tennis court because of just how
Yes.
endlessly branching it is
Yes.
down at the smallest scale.
Yeah. So it's kind of wonderful feeling that inside you is a tennis
Yeah.
court, I mean, actually. And indeed, if you took your circulatory system and you laid all those um, vessels end to end, I forget the precise answer. It's in the
I think
book.
it was
I think you go around the Earth.
100,000 kilometers, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go around the Earth certainly more than
Yeah.
once. And that's kind of amazing. It's an amazing image. It's almost spiritual, that feeling that inside you is this unbelievable length of tubing, that it's very systematic. Its structure is obeying very simple mathematical rules that are like these kinds of rules that I mentioned earlier, these the so-called
Mm.
power laws.
There's something spooky about the power laws themselves. I mean, there's this one number to which you've alluded that runs through this that almost could put someone in
Yes.
the mind of the pseudoscience of numerology. The fourth power, the
Yes.
fact that basically all these living systems
Yes.
scale to the one-fourth power.
Well, the one
Yeah.
quarter. Yes. The number four is the number that permeates all of these scaling laws. I said the three quarters for metabolic rate. It's one quarter for time scales, for
Mm.
example, and so on. And for lengths, it's very similar. It's always one quarter comes
Right.
in. And that's that 25% savings. That's not an accident. And that's the thing that comes out of the theory based on these mathematical principles of network design. And that pops out. And that four, by the way, if you look at the mathematics and ask where it comes from, it's the following. It turns out the four is actually, so to speak, not four. It's actually 3+1, which sounds, like a paradox. It's 3+1, meaning the three part of the 3+1 comes from the fact that we live in three dimensions: the up, down, and sideways. And the one is a reflection of the fractality of these systems. That it's well known among those that learn about fractals that they have peculiar sense of dimensions, and a fully fractal system is one that effectively adds an extra dimension. So there's this kind of weird extra dimension, and that's this one. So the four is actually 3+1. So if we lived in 8 dimensions, we would be dominant. We had life. It would be then everything would be dominated by the 1/9 power. And we would be, instead of saving 25%, we'd be saving, 1/9, about 11%.
Right. I feel the temptation to remind people of just what it means to be adding a dimension here in fractal terms. So, and
Yes.
it's a little hard to do on a podcast, but people can look up something, a figure. I think it's called is it the Koch curve, the KOCH?
Oh,
So
yes,
this is
yes,
so
yes,
look
yes.
this up if you want to follow us down this rabbit hole. But there's this image or this curve, which is essentially formed by an equilateral triangle being divided on each of its sides by a smaller 1/3 size equilateral triangle. And you keep doing that, just adding triangles upon triangles, and you develop a kind of snowflake-looking image. And then when you ask what's the size of that curve, of that figure, given that in the pure mathematical space you keep doing this infinitely, well, it's a fully self-contained object which actually has an infinite length of its circumference. And this doesn't map onto the real world totally, because we're not talking about infinite lengths in terms of the world in which we live,
Right,
but it
right.
does to a surprising degree. And this, Geoffrey, you could perhaps remind us of how this was first discovered, where you try to measure the
Oh,
boundary
yes.
between two countries, and that becomes
Yeah.
remarkably dependent on on basically how big a measuring stick you use.
Yes, indeed. Yes, that's one of those marvelous discoveries that sort of came out of the blue, and something that should have been known since the Greeks, but wasn't. And it was discovered by a man named Richardson, who was a kind of a polymath, but he was a kind of a geographer. And one of the things that he was interested in was the length of boundaries between countries. And he was interested in this, by the way, because he had a theory of war that somehow the incidence of conflicts between nations was proportional to the length of their boundaries. And by the way, we're talking about he developed that around the time of the First World War. But this work on measurement came much later, when he was trying to really get a quantitative handle on this. And what he and so he got hold of all these maps of various places, and he started measuring their boundaries. And one of the curious things that he first discovered was that I think the first one was between Spain and Portugal, where he found, looking at different maps, very detailed maps, that he got completely different answers. I mean, I don't remember the numbers. I wrote them in the book. But, instead of, one map might give 1,100 kilometers, and then he'd look at another map and you'd get 650 kilometers. And he would look these up in various places, and indeed he'd find different books recording these things, giving completely different numbers. And this was very mysterious. And he started looking around, and he looked across many countries, and he discovered the same phenomenon. And he was very puzzled by this. And he did realize what was going on, but he didn't formalize it. It was formalized later by a man named Benoit Mandelbrot, who termed the phrase fractal. And it's the following. It was that when people made these measurements, when you make a measurement, you have to have a ruler with a certain scale. And you have a certain resolution. So someone might measure a boundary using a resolution of only 1 mile. So you're measuring something that's 1,000 kilometers long. You only care a resolution of 1 mile. But you might have someone that has a resolution of 10 miles, and someone else might have a resolution of, I don't know, it could even be a meter in principle. And you can immediately, when you start thinking about it, you realize what the problem is. That if you measure a boundary, which is a squiggly line, and you put a ruler on it where the resolution is, say, 10 kilometers, then anything below 10 kilometers, you miss. But below that 10 kilometers, the boundary may be squiggling around. And so you miss. You measure that as 10 kilometers. But someone else with a resolution of 1 kilometer would measure it as 25 kilometers, for example. So that was the problem, he realized. And in fact, then he discovered that this followed a very regular pattern, that if you plotted the length that's measured or reported versus the resolution, there was a very simple mathematical relationship. And amazingly, that relationship is just like the relationships I talked about in terms of things like metabolic rates and all the other characteristics of organisms. And that's where the connection was to fractals. And it was Benoit Mandelbrot who realized that not just that there was this phenomenon of the problem of making measurements and resolution, but that, in fact, it was self-similar. Boundaries are approximately self-similar. So if you look at one scale and then scale that up, it just looks like what the boundary would look like at the bigger scale, and so on and so forth.
As you said, this is a genuine mystery why this wasn't discovered literally thousands of years ago. I mean, this is one of those things that was just staring everyone in the face. And
right.
Most of science is not like that. I mean, does anyone understand why this wasn't discovered before really Mandelbrot formalized it?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, that it was the hegemony of Euclidean geometry, that had been so powerful, beginning with the Greeks, but it had of course, then came down into the Renaissance and then into the Enlightenment, and of course, Newton being the great expositor and using effectively Euclidean geometry. And that was so powerful. I mean, the development of physics beginning in the end of the 17th century, but all the way through the 18th, 19th, and certainly into the 20th century, there was this, we relied on this simple idea of Euclidean geometry, this idea that a length is a length. My God, what else? You measure distance between 2 points, that's it. And the idea that it would depend on the resolution of your ruler that you're using or your scale that you're using, I don't think even entered anyone's mind. And really, until this very practical problem of Richardson and the realization of Mandelbrot, even though in the 20th century, French mathematicians had started sort of playing around with ideas that are analogous to this, but they in no way connected it to actually the measurements of that people were doing. They were much more, they were traditionally mathematical. That is, could there be anything else than Euclidean geometry kind of question? Yes, well, maybe we could have this, that, and the other. But in no way did they go out and ask, let's look at the world, make measurements and see, is it Euclidean or not? And it was this kind of the accident, if you like, of Richardson and his extraordinary insight into seeing that there was a problem. Because I'm sure other people, I suspect other people had noticed this and just put it down to error or someone made a mistake and so on. And it was Richardson's persistence as a scientist in really, tracking it down and really systematizing it that led to Mandelbrot making this extraordinary observation and breakthrough and introducing this concept of fractals. And the work that I did, in a way, was showing that, one of my criticisms, by the way, of Benoit, whom I knew, was that he loved developing the mathematics of fractals, and he was incredibly influential and insightful. But he didn't seem to care about why they were there. Where were they coming from? What's the physics of fractals, so to speak? And so it's very much highlights the difference between, if you like, a mathematician and a physicist. And I would like to think that my work is explaining within this context of why there is this fractal-like behavior that is so pervasive in biology.
Well, I'm not sure I saw it in your book, but is the physical explanation born out of just the kind of the iterative process of branching and space filling?
Well, no, it shows that iterative branching in a systematic way that, if you relate one branch of the network to the next and therefore to the next, they obey a non-linear predictable relationship, a regular predictable relationship. That's what a fractal really is. That comes out of the mathematics of analyzing these networks with constraints like the space filling and the minimization of energy and so forth. And that pops out of that. And it's highly mathematical. I said it in the book, but it was certainly, I could not give the mathematical explanation.
Right, but the mathematics is being forced by a physical constraint. So what you just said was that Benoit was fascinated by the mathematics, but he didn't really care why the mathematics were the way they were because he was not thinking as a physicist. So thinking as a physicist, what is forcing the mathematics to be what they are?
Well, he was interested in the generic mathematics of fractals and what kind of curious phenomena that are associated with having a fractal space, a space that is fractal. I was interested in, that's one kind of mathematics. I was interested and developed the mathematics that gives rise to the dynamics of flows on these networks and the geometry of these networks that allows these systems, these networks to go everywhere. That's which is not in any way a necessary aspect of
Right.
fractal, but also, as I say, this dynamics of
Yeah.
minimization.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say is that from this, I mean, the thing about developing this way of asking where does that fractal-like structure come from, showing that it comes out of these principles that then give rise to these scaling laws that we talked of earlier, then provide you with a theoretical, mathematized framework for asking all sorts of other questions, such as, the question we started out with, why do we age and why do we die kind of question. Also questions, why do we sleep and where does 8 hours of sleep a night come from, and so forth. And so there's a whole body of work that is derivative of this because there's a framework, a general framework, and you can use that to apply it to many different kinds of questions.
Well, so I want to move on to the different kinds of questions with respect to cities and other socioeconomic phenomenon. But I want to spend a moment on the question of lifespan, because this is obviously of acute interest to everyone and is what got you into this. So maximum lifespan as it relates to scale is one where, as you increase the size of, let's say, a mammal, lifespan increases. So one exception to this rule, kind of a local exception, occurred to me because when you look at the lifespans of dogs, it runs the other way. Smaller dogs live much longer than
Yes,
larger dogs.
indeed.
What explains that to you? Is that just a defect in dogs, or what's happening?
No, it's not a defect in dogs. So, as you said, there's a scaling law for lifespan. And by the way, there's a lot of variance in the scaling law for lifespan because lifespan is, from this viewpoint, is a kind of secondary phenomenon. And we can talk about that in a moment. It's not a primary phenomenon. The primary phenomenon is metabolism, living, and
Right.
reproducing. So there's a lot of variance. Nevertheless, despite that, there is, the evidence is very strong for a scaling law, which is increasing with this 1/4 power that we mentioned earlier. Now, if you just focus only on dogs, so this is, and by the way, these scaling laws are typically between species. They're not
Right.
intra-species. Nevertheless, you could ask the question, and I don't really want to go into that in any detail, but except for this question of dogs. So the important point about dogs is that they, what we call dogs, they did not evolve by natural selection.
Right.
I mean, a dog evolved by natural selection, or possibly there were two. I don't know. People debate that. But, there's one dog evolved. And then at some stage when they just, became symbiotic with us, we started training them to do different things. And we've evolved them to, be small and cuddly and sit on our laps on the one hand. On the other hand, to be able to run very fast, extremely fast, and others to go down holes and hunt for things, others to go and retrieve, and so on, others to, attack and guard. So they've evolved with all these different characteristics within being a dog. And of course, that means that they've much more, take a greyhound, huge amounts of energy has been devoted to evolving that dog so that it runs much faster than the original dog from which it evolved. And so that means various things are given up. And, so it's not easy, therefore, any longer to ask about how things scale within dogs, within the species of dog. And although there is a generic trend for bigger ones not living as long, although there's tremendous variance in that in the data on that. But what is true, if you take the average dog, or if you take a dog, I believe the dog that evolved, the original dog, was about the size of a spaniel. It was a modest-sized dog. It wasn't a small dog, wasn't a big dog, and its characteristics, are pretty much lie on where they should for a dog that
Right.
size.
So a related question here in terms of the lifespan of mammals. There's a funny detail that you discuss in your book, which is the lifespan of a mammal. Humans are slightly off the trend line here, but
Yes,
the general lifespan of a mammal is something like 1.5 billion heartbeats. They all is, and
correct.
that's just quite surprising that a mouse has the same number of heartbeats in it as a blue whale, and
Yes.
we get about 2 billion heartbeats. What do you think accounts for that? The fact that we're not on the line.
Okay, so let me just elaborate on that a little bit. So this comes out of the theoretical framework and is strongly supported by the data, namely that heart rates decrease in a systematic way, according to these quarter power laws, and lifespan increases systematically with the quarter power scaling law. And when you multiply the two things together, that is lifespan times heart rate, the increase of one, namely lifespan, is exactly cancelled out by the decrease in the other, namely heart rates, so that lifespan times heart rate should be approximately the same for everybody. But lifespan times heart rate is the number of heartbeats in a
Mm,
lifetime. So that's the thing you're
right.
referring to, which says this kind of amazing result that even though a mouse lives 2 or 3 years and a whale could live 150 years, they would have, roughly speaking, the same number of heartbeats in their life, which is sort of amazing. So, hearts of mice beat extremely fast, but they don't live very long, but in such a way that the heartbeats of a whale are extremely slow and they live a long time, but that they have the same number. And that number, as you say, is about 1.5 billion. Now, until about the middle of the 19th century, so until about 150 years ago, if you put on that graph the average lifespan of a human being, that was somewhere between 35 and 40 years. That's what the expected lifespan was of a human being. Now, some people live much longer, but of course, many died much younger. And there's the whole question of infant mortality, and I don't want to go into detail on that. But if just taking the raw numbers, it's between 35 and 40 across the globe. If you put that into this, that fits perfectly on this number. That is, that corresponds to about 1.5 billion or so heartbeats. But since then, we've, since the roughly the Industrial Revolution, we have been through this extraordinary phase in which our lifespans have been expanding at an amazing rate, so much so that now it's almost twice what it was 150 years ago and what it was for all human beings until about 1850 or so. So, now we have actually more like in the Western world, developed world, we have the equivalent to over 2.5 billion life heartbeats. And all of that is a reflection of urbanization and the extraordinary social and economic and material dynamics that we have brought to the planet. That is, and it begins with the introduction of running water and sewer lines. You know, roughly speaking, until about that time, until the middle to well, maybe beyond the middle of the 19th century, most people didn't clean themselves. I mean, there wasn't water, and the water, I
No,
mean,
not even the aristocracy.
no, I mean, really, I mean, I mean, people would go for many, many months, and sometimes possibly even years without cleaning themselves, other than maybe superficially, but not in the sense that we think of, of taking baths and washing your hands and face at least once a day and so on. And many people shower every day now and so on. But anyway, the introduction of running water, clean water, and having sewage, sort of open sewage, had a profound effect on longevity. And it started this extraordinary rise that we've seen. And of course, coupled with that, with urbanization and the idea that cities and therefore governments need to provide access to health, and the idea of clinics and all of this, all which started to develop in the 19th century. And so therefore paying much more attention to disease and understanding disease, and ultimately the development of, leading up to the development of antibiotics and so on, has led to this fantastic increase of almost a factor of 2, so that instead of, being born and expecting to live to maybe 35 to 40, you can expect to live to close to 80 now.
One question here is, what do you think the prospects are for radically extending human life? I mean, there are people like Aubrey de Grey who treat this as an engineering problem that will one day be solved.
Yep.
Does your research suggest an answer one way or the other?
Yeah, my research suggests the opposite. Mine is that, no, it doesn't. I have no problem with treating it as an engineering problem. As a kind of cartoon phrase. But I would say the following. So first of all, you cannot start thinking, at least this is my own philosophical viewpoint, thinking about extending lifespan without understanding why it is we live to the age we live, I think is already problematic for me. That is, you need to first of all have a theory that says, look, everything else being equal, a human being should live of the order of 100 years, and understand what are the parameters, what are the knobs that we can turn and twist so that we can change that. We can change it from, 100 to 200 or whatever. So that's the first kind of philosophical point. And that's what started me on this whole quest and all of this work. And one of the things that I have worked on is to get a mechanistic theory for why we age and why we die, and what leads to this 100 years as an order of magnitude for a lifespan, and to try to understand what indeed are the parameters. And to make it slightly more precise, what this theory can calculate is the maximal lifespan. What is the maximal that you could expect? And it's based on the idea of the following, that the very system that is keeping us alive, our metabolic system, has built into it what we call dissipative forces, for want of a better word, wear and tear. That, there's continual damage being done by the flow of blood through your circulatory system. Certainly, the blood flowing through your capillaries can be quite destructive, because it's like pushing fluid through very thin tubes. It has a great deal of resistance, and that resistance means, physical resistance simply means, is that there's a scraping between the blood and the walls of the cells of the capillaries, and that damages them. And that damage creates entropy. That's entropy in the language of thermodynamics. And that entropy causes cellular damage. So you can calculate all that. We have a theory, you can calculate that. And from that calculation, you determine that lifespan should scale, maximal lifespan to be more precise, should scale with this quarter power scaling. And it gives sort of a very rough estimate for longevity. Now, that tells you that the parameters that are associated with lifespan are to do with metabolism, not surprisingly, because that's keeping you alive, and that also to do with the physics the physics of materials to do with the wear and tear that's occurring at the molecular level, but also, and this is crucial, is something that's slightly outside that, but is second kind of second order way is connected to it, and that is the process of repair. Because very important, obviously, to us is that we repair damage. But where does that repair come from? That repair also has its origins in metabolism. You have to supply metabolic energy to the repair mechanisms to forestall early death. So you can ask yourself, okay, how could I extend lifespan from this picture? Well, there's two ways. One is you have to reduce damage, and the second is you have to increase repair. It's kind of obvious, and it's like any machinery. That's why I'm very open to thinking of it as an engineering problem. So how could you minimize damage due to metabolism? We said the damage came from metabolism. So one way, obviously, is to reduce your metabolic rate. Well, how can you reduce the metabolic rate? Well, you can eat less. Just eat less. That's called caloric restriction. And caloric restriction, many experiments have been done on mice in particular, and indeed caloric restriction, that is extending lifespan by feeding mice less, has by and large led to an increase in their lifespan, and many of the experiments that have been done agree with the predictions of this theory. There have been some controversial experiments in both on mice and on monkeys, which don't show such a big effect. So this is still...
I thought it didn't work in monkeys.
Yeah, so this is, and there's been criticism of those experiments of various kinds. I'm not an expert and I can't speak to that, but it's clear this is open still to a lot of work, and not enough work, by the way, is being done on it. So it's marvelous that there are people like Aubrey and so on that are thinking carefully about some of these that are different. I mean, his is focused more on mitochondria and at the intramolecular level.
As far as caloric restriction goes, I can tell you that it doesn't work for me. I can last about a day doing it, so it's not my strategy.
But you may be well, that's the point. You may end up living longer, but you have to change your lifestyle. And that's then an individual question. It turns out I'm very fortunate. I don't get hungry, so I can go for very long periods without eating. Whether that's, if I believe my own work, that means I'm maybe going to be living longer than I would have otherwise.
But do you actually pursue it as a strategy, or do you minimize?
No, I do not. No.
And what do you mean? What do you mean you don't get hungry and go for long periods without eating? What?
Oh, because I don't. No, I'm just saying naturally I don't get hungry. It's dinner time comes around and I don't feel hungry.
So, but
it's just
your
physiological defect I have.
So you're practicing essentially intermittent fasting, but so
yes,
how long do you go?
Actually, I don't do it purposely, but it's.
So I want to get a picture of this. How long do you effortlessly go without eating before you notice you should eat?
Well, for other reasons to do with health issues, which is I don't need to go into here. I went for several years eating one meal a day. So I didn't eat breakfast or dinner or lunch, and I only ate dinner. And part of that, by the way, was because I have some mysterious intolerance to most foods, which makes it very difficult for me to work. So the way I dealt with that was by eating just in the evenings. And, so my days I could be relatively clear-headed. Anyway, I could do that without very much problem. And I did lose a huge amount of weight. I'm about, let's see, I was about 30 pounds lighter than I am now. And that my doctors got concerned. I didn't even realize it, actually. And then I realized that I started to worry a bit. And then I started to get, then comes my own personal relationship with mortality. I didn't figure I would live to more than about 65 anyway. So I decided at some stage, well, forget this. I'm going to start enjoying food more, and I'm just going to eat anyway, breakfast and lunch and dinner, and forget it, and feel lousy. And if I do, well, I'd also learned, by the way, to work even though feeling lousy.
Right.
So there were a whole bunch of, personal things here.
That's a lesson I think we all need to learn.
Well, that's probably true, actually. But anyway, let me go back to the theory, because the theory does predict this, and there's lots of data that supports it. There's this funny data on monkeys, which someone needs to repeat, and it needs to be done on other animals and so forth. So it's still an open question, but certainly this theory, which has lots of things that it predicts are correct about aging, does have this as one of its predictions. But the other thing it predicts is, as I said, you can decrease, or you need to decrease your metabolic rate. Another way to decrease metabolic rate, which is extremely difficult for us, and we're almost unique among organisms, but every other organism can do this, and that is lower its temperature. So if you lower the temperature, you lower the metabolic rate, because metabolism is derived from chemical reactions. And chemical reaction theory tells you how that things slow down when you decrease the temperature. It's not surprisingly, temperature is is a reflection of the interaction among molecules. And if you lower the temperature, means there's less interaction among the molecules. Therefore, there's the metabolic rate goes down, and it goes down exponentially. So a small change in temperature produces a large change in chemical reaction rates, and therefore a large change in metabolic rate. And you can predict what this is. And there are lots of data on animal, what's called ectotherms, animals that are cold-blooded, which is the vast, almost all organisms are. And the theory fits beautifully the data, or the data. Maybe I should tell you the other way around. The data beautifully confirms the prediction. And so that's very nice. However, that's very difficult for us, although there have been experiments on mice, again, where they've introduced drugs that lower body temperature. And the claim there is that it does increase longevity. So there's lots of evidence, I would say, supporting evidence that decreasing metabolism increases lifespan. And, that brings up, a similar issue that you mentioned about caloric restriction. There are drugs, apparently, since they've used them on mice, that would lower body temperature and therefore lower metabolism. But goodness knows what other unintended consequences that has. And including just the lowering of metabolism itself. Do we want to live long and be couch potatoes? No, we don't. We want to have kind of, a healthy, lively, passionate life right to the end. You don't sort of want to extend it for the sake of extending it. So there's all kinds of social and personal issues that come up. Now, the other way of extending lifespan is to increase repair mechanism, and that's related sort of to these questions of telomere lengths and so forth. But, one could imagine genetic intervention to increase repair mechanisms. And, there are animals that have special repair mechanisms that we don't have, ones that, for example, attack specific tumors, as an example, and so forth. And one could imagine, this is kind of scary stuff in a way, and it's, would require great care as to the unintended consequences of doing something like that. But, that's what many people are thinking about. But it also brings up this other issue that I brought up a moment ago, which is, yes, you might, even if you do this and you minimize the unintended consequences, one of the other unintended consequences may be that you're allocating now so much more energy to repair than you would do naturally, that, you're tired and exhausted all the time. So again, it's a lifestyle question. And so all these are issues that we need to think about very, very carefully.
On the question of tumors, doesn't scale have some implication here? Because
Yes,
mice get many more tumors and
yes,
whales apparently get none, or at least we haven't found cancer in things like blue whales.
yes, they don't get them. So this is again, that brings up, I mean, you can apply these ideas to cancer, and you could argue again that cancer, many tumors are triggered by damage from metabolism, and many are, and maybe even most of them are. Come from damage problems. And you can, from that, derive, first of all, you can understand the tumors independently of that. That is, you can understand the metabolism of the tumor itself and of its vasculature, or how it's being supported by the host, namely us. And these are potentially very important for developing therapeutic interventions. But one of the more interesting things is that, as far as we can tell, roughly speaking, the lifetime number of tumors is roughly the same, independent of the size of the mammal. So, so this does bring up the question, if mice get many more tumors than we do, and all the experiments we're doing on mice concerning cancer, we need to understand that. We need to understand why this is so before we extrapolate experiments and interventions on mice to human beings. So this is, an area which requires much more detailed research, as well as developing this big picture.
Okay, so I want to plunge into the socioeconomic phenomenon like cities, but before we go there, I want to ask you about the concept of emergence, because when we're talking about
Yes,
complex systems, we're often talking about so-called emergent phenomenon or emergent properties.
indeed.
And this extends, across the board to everything from consciousness or minds generally to things like economic systems. This is often the concept of emergence is often put forward as a kind of embarrassment to reductionism. It's often said that you just can't understand consciousness or minds or economic systems in terms of their constituent atoms, right? We'll never understand the difference between a totalitarian society and a free one in terms of particle physics. And I've often been a little skeptical of what is being claimed here. And so and since complexity is really your wheelhouse, I want to get your thoughts on this. But to sketch this out a little bit more so that our listeners understand my concerns. The idea is that we're urged to acknowledge that reality at every level has a description that's appropriate to it, and therefore you can't reduce everything to physics. And I've long wondered whether this is a bit of a dodge, because, for instance, if you take something like the mind, if you believe, as many, certainly most neuroscientists do, that the mind is simply what the brain is doing, and everything the brain is doing is at bottom a matter of moment-to-moment changes in its neurophysiology, well, then it might be true to say that it'll never be convenient to talk about something like your appreciation of Shakespeare in terms of neurotransmitters. But it would also be just true that every instance of appreciating Shakespeare just is a neurophysiological event, and it's realized or not at this basic level. And so the lower level really would still be primary. There would be no downward causation. It's not that there's a mind that is an emergent property of the brain that is acting on the brain. They're simply states of the brain, each following the next. And so I'm wondering if you can think of an example where there is a higher level phenomenon that truly has causal powers as a higher level phenomenon that are not reducible at some point to the causal powers of its constituents, of the lower level phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, this is, of course, an ongoing discussion, and is especially in the area you brought up, in dealing with mind and brain and so forth. But I've sort of I'm sort of more along your lines, is my thinking, and less along the lines that there's something completely new emerges. Because, let's take something that is presumably a little simpler than than the brain and mind problem, and one that I have thought about some, and that is the city, which we'll probably talk about a little bit. But a city is, the idea of emergence, where I do like the concept, is that, a city is not the sum of all the people in it, and it's not the sum of all the roads and all the buildings. It's not the sum of all the events that take place in it. There's something, much more than that. And, it's some integration of all those. And it's useful as a concept to think of it as some collective phenomenon and talk about its own individuality. And we do, obviously, talk about New York or San Francisco and so on. So it has it does have a sense of individuality, but obviously it is the sum of, it is derivative of all of these individual components. I don't think anyone would deny that. That is clearly true. And I would say the kind of in-between road I take is that, yes, in principle, you could imagine that the city is the sum of all the multidimensional variables of which it is composed. So there's, it's not just 10 million citizens that live in a given city and the length of all the roads and all that, but it's some integration of all that, and each one could be, pinpointed as a variable, and each one you could imagine has some dynamic associated with it in terms of its interaction with everything else. And so you come to this this concept, which is the concept really that is inherent in the idea of complexity and complex systems, that yes, it is made of constituents, but if we start to delineate them, it's almost an infinite number, and associated with them is an infinite number of equations. And of course, that means that you can't come to terms with that. I mean, that's not even becomes then conceptually not a soluble problem, and a way of deriving what the dynamic of a city is, whether it's organization or growth or structure.
Yeah, well, I get the way complexity limits our ability to forecast or even describe, but my question is really whether higher level phenomenon ever have causal powers that are not simply a matter of lower level phenomenon having causal powers. Almost the simplest possible example comes to mind here, where imagine two stones, and you have one stone that is spherical and one stone that's shaped like a cube, and you put them on the side of a hill or an inclined plane. Now, the sphere will roll down the plane, and the cube won't. You could argue that its higher level property of being spherical allows one system of atoms to behave totally differently than another. But
Right.
even in that case, is this really downward causation? Isn't this still really a matter of what the individual atoms are doing in concert with the other individual atoms of the plane?
Yes, I mean, of course, ultimately it is, but I do go back to that. It's not a it's not a useful. In fact, I would even say, thinking of that problem, it's a useless description. It's not. It doesn't help us, in describing that motion, right? I mean, if you wrote down the equations for every atom in the cubic block and every atom for the spherical block, there's no way, there's no in a finite time to determine what the motion is. So in that sense, to me, it's a moot question. It's like, much more useful to have the concept of, of this collective that you call the stone, that has a certain shape, give it that geometry, that macroscopic shape, and it's, which is determined by its, ultimately by its construction of its, the molecules and their interaction. That gives rise to the shape, and then move to that next level, that higher level of where it's where the sphericity plays a critical role.
I mean, there's no question that we need to talk about geometry and Shakespeare and mental states in terms other than solving endless equations for individual atoms. You'll get no dispute from me there. This concept of emergence is often sold to us as, again, this a kind of downward causation issue, which
Yes.
it has always seemed a little spooky to me, and I wanted to see if you could perform an
Yes.
exorcism on my doubts or share them.
Well, I don't like very often. I do like the concept of emergence because it's a very useful concept for thinking about many problems. That there is a collective phenomenon that it goes beyond just the individual constituents. And part of this is semantic because it depends what you call constituents. I mean, as I said about a city, often one thinks when you think of a city in a certain way, you think its constituents are people. Another way, you might think of it as the buildings and so on. So one has to be careful. And I think that's true of the brain as well. After all, one of the amazing things about thinking about the brain is almost no one talks about the fact that all those neurons have to be supported by an energy system. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, it has to be metabolized. So integrated with that neural system, which is doing all the firing and which is presumably the origin of our consciousness and mind, along with that is all of this extraordinary dynamics of the circuitry system feeding it. And it has to do it in a highly integrated way, highly local in space and time. Now, when we think of the constituents of the brain, we don't talk about those. We don't think about the capillaries of the circulatory system, of which there are as many, if not more, than there are neurons. So, and the brain and our mind is, in that sense, to use that language, is an emergent phenomenon coming from, not just all those neurons or that white matter and gray matter and the electrical firings, but also of the support system and the whole infrastructure that is giving rise to this. So, it's one has to be very careful, I think, in the way one uses this language. I don't use it at all in a technical way. And I think it is, and I only use it in a descriptive way. I think it's good for narrative and it's good for description. I'm very loath, as the word complexity,
Right.
by the way, I have similar feelings about complexity. They're useful words, but, I think one should be careful about taking them too seriously. And so it's a bit of a cop out, I must admit.
Well, no, it actually it's one of those cop outs that jives with my intuition. So it's one that I like.
Yeah.
In the spirit of confirmation
Okay.
bias.
Good.
Uh, Thank you for enabling
Yeah.
me. We're going to move recklessly from brains to cities, but there's a connection here. I mean, you almost describe cities as almost like a fractal adumbration of the fractal structure of the brain. And much of what you say about cities, there's a note you sound at various points in the book where it's almost that the question is whether civilization will fail, right? I mean, what is the future of this whole
Yeah.
project? And
Right.
it has more than a little to do with the future of cities. And I'll just set this up by pointing out a few things you say here. I mean, one thing you point out is that cities are very hard to kill. They tend to survive even if you drop a nuclear bomb on them, as we discovered. And whereas companies die and obviously organisms die, companies die to a degree that will surprise some people. I think you say that half of all publicly traded companies disappear within 10 years of entering the market, which I found astonishing.
I did too, by the way, when we did the
Yeah,
analysis.
it really is. And here we're talking about publicly traded companies. We're not talking about all companies.
Yes, publicly traded, already on the stock exchange.
So why do cities matter, and how do you view the future of innovation and the survival of civilization through the lens of
Oh.
cities?
Yeah, this is, of course,
good luck with that.
We could spend as much time on this as we have on the rest of it. And indeed, this is where my passion is at the moment. But I'm really pleased that you brought up, by the way, this connection between cities and brains, because one of the things that distinguishes cities from organisms is that cities integrate in real time, so to speak, both the infrastructure, which is very much like biology, the roads and the transport systems in general, and gas lines and water lines and electrical lines and so on. So that's very much like the way we were sort of talking about biology. But they have this other piece, which really isn't usually a part of an organism, and that is the interaction between its constituents, if you like, namely the social network structure that is implicit in cities, and which is us talking about what we're doing now, except we don't happen to be in the same city, but interacting with each other and forming groups and modular parts of networks and so on, which has led ultimately to the extraordinary socioeconomic system and quality of life and standard of living to which we're privileged. And that is something that doesn't exist in biology, and the kind of structure of the networks that underlie that dynamic, our social networks, are very similar in their mathematics. Namely, they are fractal-like. They have this fractal kind of quality to them in terms of our social organization. But they also have another part that's quite different, and that is, instead of an economy of scale, meaning the bigger you are, the less per capita, these networks induce something that is the opposite behavior. The bigger you are, the more per capita. And you can sort of see that in terms of, I talk to you, you talk to a friend of yours, he talks to someone else, and then they talk to me, and we all get together. And we have this sort of positive feedback mechanism. Ideas develop. Conversations have a kind of progression. And ultimately, that dynamic, which is formalized in terms of our commerce and our business and our economies and our finance, but also in terms of our universities and educational institutions, that phenomenon of positive feedback, of people interacting with each other, is something that we discovered only extremely recently, only in the last few thousand years, and especially when we evolved from being hunter-gatherers to forming sedentary communities and ultimately cities. That is the origin of our huge difference and enormous success, if in terms of socioeconomic values. So, and there's nothing like it in biology, and that is, what has led to this, the phenomena of wealth creation, the phenomena of innovation, and the phenomenon of idea creation.
The nonlinearity does cut both ways here, because you get more of the wealth, but you also get more of the crime and the influenza. And
absolutely. So the thing that is fantastic about cities, and cities are the engine, by the way, you asked earlier, cities are the engine that we invented for facilitating and enhancing that social interaction. And that's why more wealth is created in cities, ideas are created in cities, innovation takes place in cities. And that's where the buzz and the activity is, the kind of feeling of a sexy life in a city, with more opportunities, more restaurants. All of this is coming from this positive feedback mechanism. But it has the consequence that it's all socioeconomic activity, which means the good, bad, and the ugly come together. So whereas you might get a higher wage in a city, you might have more social interactions in a city, more access to culture, more museums, restaurants, and all the rest of it. You also get greater access, sadly, to more crime, more pollution, more disease, and so forth. So, and the amazing thing I think that we discovered was that all of these socioeconomic activities that I just mentioned all come along to the same degree. That is, the scaling of cities between themselves in terms of these characteristics and metrics, as I say, everything from wages to the number of AIDS cases to the length of the roads and so on. All of these scale effectively in the same way to each other, effectively, and in the same way across the globe, whether you look in the United States, European countries, Japan, China, Latin America, and so on. So there's a kind of extraordinary universality to cities underlying their extraordinary diversity and complexity, mimicking the extraordinary simplicity in the scaling laws underlying the diversity and complexity of organisms.
Also, we should say that the pace with which we are adding cities to the globe, or which people are adding themselves to cities and growing the cities in size, is astonishing. It's something like a city of 1.5 million has to be created every week, which gives us a new New York metropolitan area of 15 million people every 2 months or so.
That's correct. And, if you just average the numbers from now to mid-century, that's roughly what it says, and that is phenomenal. So I often say, many people are very familiar with the idea that we live in an expanding universe, that from the Big Bang. But many people don't somehow, even though they live it and they're part of it, don't realize that we're living in an exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe, and it's manifested in these kinds of numbers that and another number is that China is going to be building 200 to 300 new cities in the next 15 or 20 years, each in excess of 1 million people, because it has to urbanize several hundred million people in the next in the relatively near future. So this is an astonishing rate. And you realize 200 to 300 new cities of 1 million each, that means creating the urban structure of the United States in China in the next 15 to 20 years. That is, now, whether they can do that or not, I don't know, but that's what they talk about. But the effect that it's going to have in terms of the pressure on the rest of us, in terms of access to energy, to resources, to things like water and rare metals, and the stress on the social fabric.
Although paradoxically, you make this point that cities are actually greener than smaller towns. I mean, if you're an environmentalist, you should live in New York, right?
Yes, no, this is in terms of, so this is a curious thing. It's something I didn't mention, but we sort of skipped over it. So even though cities scale the same way across the globe, first of all, they scale differently than biology. They scale with the same mathematics, these simple power laws. But instead of a 25% savings on infrastructure, as we see in biology, in cities we get a 15% saving. So instead of a 3/4 scaling, we get a 0.85 roughly. So there's a 15% savings. But and that's an economy of scale in terms of infrastructure. You need less gas stations per capita, the bigger the city, governed by this 15% rule. But on the socioeconomic side, we see a 15% increase of everything. So those things that I talked about were that wages and AIDS cases and roads and electrical lines and educational institutions all increased by about 15% above just doubling every time you double the size of a city. So that's what we call superlinear scaling, as distinct from the sublinear scaling of the infrastructure. Now to your observation, your question about the the carbon footprint. If you have, as you increase size, you have 15% less infrastructure, and in particular, 15% less transport, so to speak, is needed. Then that means that you have, roughly speaking, you might expect 15% less of carbon emissions, for example. Well, it's not quite 15%, but there is a definite trend that the bigger you are in terms of a city, the less carbon footprint per capita there is from the individual. So New York is, in fact, the greenest city in the United States. And I live in Santa Fe, which is a city of, of the order of 100,000 people. It's, of course, one of the most profligate in terms of its carbon footprint, even though, it has a much more idyllic feeling to it in terms of, one's image than, say, New York does. So these are very important things that we need to understand.
Okay, so in the last few minutes, Geoffrey, I want you to plunge us either into feelings of doom and gloom or our brightest hopes. And it's focused on this question of innovation, because you really paint the imperative of innovation. There's really a choice between innovation and catastrophe on your account, and innovation has to keep accelerating. And I get this image now when I think about this of civilization being this Ponzi scheme that just has to keep going or it all collapses. What is the burden of innovation as it is currently felt, and what are the prospects that we will keep innovating at a pace sufficient to get us to kind of have a durable civilization?
So one of the things we didn't talk about in biology was growth. And one of the things that comes out of the theory is that you can understand growth and understand growth curves. That is, how does the size of a system, the size of an organism such as us, change, with time? How do we grow? And one of the satisfying things about the theory is that it predicts very nicely growth curves. That is, that you grow quickly and you stop growing. And it explains why it is that you stop growing. It's the theory applies to any organism, and it's quite universal. It only has 2 or 3 parameters in it, and it can explain the growth of any organism, so much so that the theory tells you how to rescale all organisms so it appears that they all grow in the same way and at the same rate. So it's a very nice package. But one of the most important things that comes out of this is that the reason that you stop growing, or organisms stop growing, is intimately related to the sublinear nature of these quarter-power scaling laws, that you have economies of scale lead to the cessation of growth. So it turns out in biology, you can summarize all of that stuff, all derived from the network theory, that organisms grow in this way that leads to a stable configuration. They stop growing. As they get bigger, the bigger an organism is, the slower its pace of life. Everything slows down and it lives longer. It ultimately dies. So all of that comes out of this generic network theory. Now, in biology, in cities, and in particular, instead of having this sublinear scaling, you have, in terms of its socioeconomic dynamic, we have this superlinear scaling. And if you then ask, how does that feed into the growth of a city using the same kinds of ideas, you discover that the city can grow indefinitely. It has this open-ended growth, which is fantastic because it's very consistent. That's what we see. Most cities, traditionally cities have just kept growing, and the socioeconomic enterprise has kept growing with them. And that is intimately related to its superlinear behavior. The other thing that comes along with superlinear behavior is that, again, in contradistinction to biology, the pace of life increases with size rather than decreases. So life gets faster the bigger you are. Life in New York is quantitatively and predictively faster than it is in a place like Santa Fe. People walk faster, transactions take place faster, and so on. So, but you have this kind of open-ended growth. So it's very nice and it's very satisfying, except it has built into it a kind of fatal flaw, if you like. And technically, mathematically, that's called a finite time singularity. And what that means in English is that in some finite time, could be 5, 10 years, 100 years in the future, whatever the metric is that you're looking at, whose growth you're looking at, and it could be, the GDP of the city, could be the number of restaurants in the city, could be the number of AIDS cases in the city, will become infinite, which is completely nuts. So, and the theory tells you what happens. It says that the system stagnates and then collapses. That leads to its death. So it's kind of a fancy version of Malthus in a way, to be honest. It's a kind of neo-Malthusian argument, but wrapped up in some fancy mathematics.
Except in the city with an infinite number of restaurants.
Yes. So the question is, how do you get out of it? And this is where innovation comes in. Because you realize that, when you talk about this growth and you talk about these scaling laws, it's all within a given paradigm, a given innovative paradigm, such as one has, we've discovered iron, or we've discovered coal, or we've invented computers, or we've discovered IT, something of that magnitude, which sort of has a almost universal cultural implication, as well as socioeconomic implication. And it effectively resets the clock. It's a paradigm shift where the system effectively starts over again. So the way you avoid this stagnation and collapse is that somewhere before you reach the singularity, you have to make a major innovation, which resets the clock and you start over again. Now, of course, when you start over again, once again, you'll hit a finite time singularity in principle. So you have to innovate again before that to reset the clock and, so to speak, reinvent yourself. So there's a sort of little theorem, so to speak, that you can that comes out of this, and that is that if you demand continuous open-ended growth, then you have to have continuous innovation cycles. Well, that's not, that's sort of been talked about a lot. But the catch to this is not only does the pace of life have to be continually speeding up as you grow, but the time between innovations has to get shorter and shorter, so that you have to accelerate this rate at which you're innovating. So to put it in cartoon terms, it might have taken you 100 years to develop an idea 1,000 years ago. Now it only takes 25 years because of this positive feedback mechanism that's coming from built into the social network. That speeds everything up, gives rise to superlinear scaling, and demands that for the system to remain open-ended and viable, you need to have accelerating innovation. So, that brings up a whole bunch of questions. I mean, so it says that, we just had it took us maybe 25 years to go from, computers, laptops to IT. We're going to have to make another major innovation in maybe 20 years to something that will have as big an impact. And then, in less than 20 years after that, you're going to have to have another one, and so on and so forth. And you can make a kind of reductio ad absurdum argument that eventually you're going to have to be making a major innovation, revolutionary innovation, paradigm shift every year or every 6 months and so on, which is obviously crazy. So something quite dramatic has to change in this dynamic for us to avoid this. And so what we see is that the mantra, the traditional mantra, particularly economists and others, that, all of the problems we face, well, don't worry about them because we're going to innovate our way out of them. Well, to some extent, that is certainly true. But in another way, when you look at it through this lens, what you see is that those innovations are simply postponing the big problem. And so the question is, how do we get out of it? And, one of the things that I have been thinking about is that, mostly when we think of innovation, we think of it in terms of physical, technological kinds of terms, all the ones that we've mentioned and all the ones that traditionally talked about. Maybe we need to define what we mean by an innovation or a paradigm shift, and or what we mean by growth. And so just in terms of growth, the growth is traditionally measured by physical kind of quantities, in particular economic quantities, and like the GDP. And maybe we should start thinking about introducing real metrics for quality of life and happiness and contentment. I mean, this is a bit of a platitude, but people have, of course, started thinking about it. But maybe we should take that quite seriously and think in different terms. And that's associated with innovation as a technical innovation and rather as a cultural or social innovation. Something, because as I was saying earlier, underlying all of this dynamic is the dynamic of dynamics built into social networks, the continuous positive feedback that is part of who we are in terms of our communities and our collective behavior. And, that we cannot change and don't want to change. But maybe if we could have a cultural shift where that gets channeled into a different way of thinking or a different way of dealing with our external reality, maybe that's a way out. And that's huge. That's truly revolutionary. And
does that say, Geoffrey? Are you suggesting that much of what is material will become virtual? I mean, how do we actually, escape entropy here? Or
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it would be virtual. Maybe it would be, just a way of being in terms of, the kinds of desires that we have.
Simpler lives.
Yes, because part of the dynamic is clearly a manifestation of greed, for want of a better word, and that's not. And I don't mean that necessarily pejoratively. Just that we want more. We want to have more than more cars than we need, or more IT than we need. I'm going to have to buckle down soon, no doubt, and get an iPhone 7 or whatever. But there's that treadmill effect, and the question is, can we tame that in some way and channel some of that energy into social phenomena and cultural phenomena, and still have a vibrant and have growth in that, but have a vibrant kind of socioeconomic society with wealth creation and innovation, without this need for continuous, almost mindless growth. I mean, that's the paradigm we invented. It's been unbelievably successful. I mean, it's extraordinary. And we want to save as much of it as we can, but it seems to have built in it some potentially fatal flaws. So that's the issue. And I must say, I don't know. I've not thought this through carefully, and many of the ideas are still very fuzzy. And in fact, I refrained from thinking too much about it because I thought it requires a truly revolutionary change. And that's going to be impossible. And then, amazingly, the Trump phenomenon has made me rethink it because, whatever Mr. Trump is, one of the things that he has induced is the potential of a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift I don't like, namely that, up to now, our socioeconomic system, and particularly our political system, relies on a certain degree of rationality, a certain degree of trust, a certain degree of believing in facts, believing in science, believing in rational argument. And suddenly along comes this person in a leadership position, a very powerful position, who has violated a lot of that. And under what I would have thought as normal conditions, this man wouldn't last 5 minutes. Quite the contrary, at least half of the nation doesn't seem to care. And, they've gone from sort of being part of an old system to just saying, well, it doesn't matter. This is fine. We can make things up as we go along. We don't have to be consistent. We don't have to pay attention to all the facts, or to any facts, maybe. That seems to be what is developing. And, it's hard to see society running that way. But if that is sustained for the next several years, that is a paradigm shift, because what's going to happen is that everybody will start behaving like this, so to speak. So this is what the kind of speculative thoughts I've had. And whereas, I abhor what is happening because it violates many of the things that I believe in and that many of us believe in, nevertheless, the fact that, 150 million people, apparently, or whatever it is, have just gone along with it means that you can actually have a major paradigm shift culturally and socially. And so maybe we could do that, but in ways that would solve this problem, be much more positive, where we do believe in science, believe in all those things, and indeed believe that we can have a new kind of life where, our ideas of success and contentment are not primarily linked, or only linked, maybe that's the way of saying it, only linked to material well-being, that there are other dimensions and other metrics that might be that we might all agree to. So this is speculative, it's a bit flaky, but it's something that but we do need to come to terms with this question of being on this accelerating treadmill of innovation.
Well, listen, Geoffrey, I don't think I've ever seen someone find such a surprising silver lining in this mass psychosis that we have witnessed politically. But I think it's actually a fascinating point. I think before I follow you into a future of neo-Ludditism where we are perfectly content as contemplative monastics, I'm going to need a little more IT, given the pains we suffered at the end of this interview trying to get linked up.
The question is, can we have our cake and eat it too? We don't want to be Luddites, but so I don't want to be sort of proposing any kind of Luddite solution. Quite the contrary. I think the question is there a way of, so to speak, threading the needle here that we can have, as they say, have our cake and eat it too in some way.
Yeah, no, I totally take your point. I think the future is some hybrid, or the sustainable future is some hybrid of super high-tech perfection of IT and whatever can be virtual should be virtual, and a greater ethical and intellectual norm of simplicity in some sense, simplicity
Yes.
of attention and contentment and a contemplative life. Yeah.
Is it possible to do any of that?
I think it is. I'm pretty sure you and I can do it, Geoffrey.
Well, maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I don't know about 7 billion people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, listen, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time, and it's been fascinating to get this much of your mind onto the podcast. Thank you so much, Geoffrey.
That was a pleasure.
If you're enjoying the Waking Up podcast, there are many ways you can support it at samharris.org/support. As a supporter of the podcast, you'll get early access to tickets to my live events, and you'll get exclusive access to my Ask Me Anything episodes, as well